The pristine, porcelain image of the Golden Age leading lady was a meticulously crafted lie, a product of studio finishing schools and the iron-fisted Hays Code. But behind the velvet curtains and away from the rolling cameras, some of Hollywood's most iconic women possessed vocabularies that would make a longshoreman blush. While the public saw poise and heard mid-Atlantic elegance, the crews and co-stars often heard a barrage of four-letter words and body humor that shattered the ladylike facade. To understand the real history of Hollywood, you have to look past the soft focus and listen to the women who refuse to be silenced by the standards of proper society, using vulgarity not just as a habit, but as a weapon of independence in an industry that tried to own their every word. Perhaps no one embodied the profane angel archetype better than Carole Lombard, the high-salary queen of screwball comedy who was as famous for her stunning beauty as she was for being one of the boys. Lombard was notorious for her ability to outswear anyone on the Paramount lot. She didn't use profanity out of anger, but rather as a way to level the playing field in a male-dominated environment. On the set of films like My Man Godfrey, Lombard would stroll into a room of executives or rough-necked lighting crews and drop a string of expletives that would immediately command the room's attention. She famously stated that she used man talk because it cut through the nonsense of Hollywood politics. Her vulgarity was a tool of efficiency. She had no patience for the delicate, fainting flower routine that was expected of stars in the 1930s. If a scene wasn't working, she wouldn't politely suggest a change. She would let out a blue streak of frustration that forced everyone to stop and listen. This bluntness, combined with her legendary generosity, made her one of the most beloved figures in the industry, proving that a woman could be a fashion icon and a foul-mouthed firecracker simultaneously without losing an ounce of her glamour. If Lombard was the profane angel, Tallulah Bankhead was the undisputed queen of the unfiltered. Bankhead didn't just break the rules of polite conversation. She set them on fire and danced on the ashes. Known for her gravelly voice and her penchant for calling everyone darling, simply because she couldn't remember their names, Tallulah's personal conversations were a minefield of sexual frankness and coarse language. She was a woman who spoke openly about her flings, her drinking, and her disdain for the boring morals of the era. She once famously remarked that her father had warned her about men and booze, but he never said a word about women and cocaine. Bankhead's vulgarity was a performance in itself, a rebellious act against the Southern belle expectations of her upbringing. She would often appear in interviews or at high society parties and drop bombshells that would leave reporters speechless, thriving on the shock value of her own wit. To Tallulah, vulgarity was just another word for honesty, and she refused to apologize for a single syllable of her scandalous vocabulary. Ava Gardner was another titan of the screen who possessed a sailor's mouth that stood in stark contrast to her status as the world's most beautiful animal. Gardner was a woman of raw, earthy appetites who grew up in the tobacco fields of North Carolina and never lost that gritty, no-nonsense edge. When she arrived in Hollywood, the studios tried to polish her into a sophisticated siren, but the real Ava was a woman who preferred barefoot walks, stiff drinks, and language that was as salt of the earth as her upbringing. Her marriage to Frank Sinatra was a legendary cycle of passionate love and explosive, profanity-laced public brawls. Gardner didn't care about image. She would tell a director exactly where he could shove a bad script, and she was known for being one of the few actresses who could go toe-to-toe with Hemingway in a drinking and swearing contest. Her vulgarity was a sign of her authenticity. She despised the phoniness of the star system and used her blunt language to keep the sycophants and studio heads at arm's length. She was a woman who lived by her own rules, and if you didn't like the way she talked, she was more than happy to tell you exactly where to go. The hidden vulgarity of the era often came from those who cultivated the most regal personas, such as Joan Crawford. While the public saw a woman who sat on the board of Pepsi-Cola and personified MGM's high-class style, those who worked for her described a woman who could turn into a verbal flamethrower at the slightest provocation. Crawford's vulgarity was often fueled by her intense perfectionism and her drive for control. Behind closed doors, her language was reportedly vicious, often directed at assistants or family members who failed to meet her impossible standards. This wasn't the fun profanity of Carole Lombard. It was a cold, calculated use of language intended to exert power. The contrast between the woman who would spend hours responding to fan mail with perfect etiquette and the woman who would unleash a barrage of four-letter words over a misplaced coat hanger is what defined the dark side of Crawford's legend. Her vulgarity was a symptom of the immense pressure she felt to maintain her position in a world that was constantly waiting for her to fail. Then there was Katharine Hepburn, whose vulgarity was less about obscenity and more about a sharp, biting directness that felt like a slap in the face to the polite conventions of the time. Hepburn was famously salty, often using language that was seen as unfeminine to assert her intellectual dominance. She had no time for the sweetheart act and would often use coarse metaphors or blunt descriptions to get her point across. She once told a reporter who was prying into her personal life to go sit on a tack, and her on-set arguments with directors were legendary for their lack of ladylike restraint. Hepburn's vulgarity was a form of intellectual elitism. She used her sharp tongue to weed out the weak and the foolish. She was a woman who wore pants when it was a scandal and spoke her mind when it was a crime, and her refusal to sugarcoat her words was a key part of the fierce independence that made her a four-time Oscar winner. She proved that being vulgar could also mean being the smartest person in the room. Finally, we have Bette Davis, a woman whose entire career was built on the foundation of a sharp, acidic tongue. As previously seen in the chronicles of her life, Davis didn't just use vulgarity. She inhaled it and blew it back out as smoke. Her arrogance and her penchant for verbal assassination were legendary. She would use the most colorful language imaginable to describe a co-star's lack of talent or a producer's lack of vision. Davis's vulgarity was a byproduct of her absolute conviction that she was the center of the cinematic universe. She didn't use profanity to be one of the boys like Lombard. She used it to remind everyone that she was the boss. Her scandals and her feuds were often punctuated by comments that were too blue for the newspapers of the day to even print. For Bette, a well-placed expletive was like a period at the end of a sentence. It signaled that the conversation was over because she had won. Her vulgar reputation was something she wore like a suit of armor, protecting her from an industry that she felt was always trying to diminish her greatness. These women used vulgarity as a form of survival. In a system that wanted them to be silent, decorative, and compliant, their foul mouths were a declaration of humanity. They were complicated, angry, funny, and deeply flawed women who refused to be contained by a studio-mandated script.